Good morning. All right, we'll do it the same way. Otherwise, I will say it in my language this time, actually, and then you repeat, okay? So in Arabic, we'll say Sabah al Khair. Oh, good. Okay. All right, I have a couple of announcements to make. And then Dr. Mahir Kanadi will start his session today on human rights. Number one, today's seminar is a little bit different. All the students in the NRSD, in the Environment, Peace and Development Program, and RAMSET, and Water Cooperation. All those students, after class, after the session with Mihir and the break, will go to the Earth Charter building. There is a big classroom there, and that is for the occasion of the re-accreditation ceremony of their department. So please, all of those students will not attend the seminar today. Instead, they will go to the Earth Charter. The other students who are not enrolled in that department will continue to have a seminar today, except we're going to have only 2 seminar groups. One will be with me here in this council room, and that will include the students in my group who are not from the environment department, and the students who are in Jan's group, and the students who are in Tia's group. So Tia and Jan students, please stay here. And if you remember from the week 1, we said that I will come to every seminar group at one point, so that will be equal to my visit to your group. But if you still want the students from environment want me to come one session next week, let your facilitator know and I'll arrange it. The students from Maria Teresa's group and from Alonso's group, they will meet in classroom 1. Easy? Yeah, which is the last room to here today, which is where Alonso meets usually. So Alonso and Maria Teresa, classroom 1. Tia, Jan, and my group are here, regular seminar. Okay? That was clear? Okay, the second issue is your, first good luck with your presentation on Friday. And I see that all of you are working very well and people coming asking very good questions. So good luck with that. I know also some of you have questions about writing your final paper. And there are questions about format and what is expected and so on. So 2 things. Number 1, in terms of format and style, of course you have in the instructions in the syllabus how many, the word count, how many words we're expecting this to be. So stick to that. In terms of the font, what font to use, that's up to you. I mean, if you want to use Times Roman or use Book Antique, whatever it is, use something, of course, that's legible in English. And second, use APA style, American Psychological Association style of references. Referencing is very important. And how are you going to reference? How are you going to make a list of references at the end of your paper? And how are you going to cite things and put it in the proper quotation? Be careful of being misunderstood for plagiarizing. It happens a lot, unfortunately, and people don't realize how serious this is. So you don't want to start your academic year with a misunderstanding that you are plagiarizing. Plagiarizing means that you take somebody else's work and put it as if this is your work, or you don't give them clarity that you took this work from someone else. You must make sure that you follow the instructions of the APA style on how to do the citations and how to reference. That's in terms of the format and style. In terms of content, your final paper is not a conflict analysis. Unlike your group presentation is a conflict analysis, using whether CRC Papio or any other model you are familiar with. For the final paper, we want you to choose a topic that is on your political, social, cultural level in your context that you're familiar with or you're interested in. And you will do your research in the paper about what are the challenges to peace in that situation. Meaning, there is a situation, obviously something is not going exactly right. So you have a brief assessment of the situation and description, but then talking about what is hindering this situation from reaching peace. Whatever peace means, and of course you'll go into what you think peace will look like, and what is not helping this to happen. If you are talking about a situation that already peace took place, then maybe you will be reflecting on what helped and what didn't help to move this peace forward, or what else can be done. So the focus is on the outcome, the piece, and how it can happen, what is not helping it to happen, and if it has already happened, then you reflect on what helped this to take place or what still needs to be done. This should be the focus of your lecture. Today, a student wrote me, I want to look at the certain situation, I assume the political, economic issues are factors in affecting it. Is this okay? I said, absolutely. So you realize that in one situation, some political dynamics and some environmental and some economic are hindering. Explain, of course, what is that and why is it not helping? And of course, what do you suggest that can be done? Any questions, please talk to us and talk to the facilitators. I'm more than happy to explain more. And if you're still kind of pondering what topic to use and not sure, also please come to us. And we'll be happy to give you ideas, but it's your choice, of course, what topic you want to work on. Questions, comments? Clear? Okay, good. I'll take it now, turn it to Dr.
Thank you, Amar. Good morning, everyone. So today we are midterm in this 3-week course. It's the middle of the course, and it's a good moment to take stock and kind of situate today's topic in the larger context of your course. Last week with Amar, you all were introduced to the different theories of peace and conflict studies. You also learned the tools such as CRC Fabio for conflict mapping and conflict analysis. You were also introduced to conflict behavior theories. And one of the take-homes from the last week was clearly, and that was at least the intention, that peace and conflict studies is extremely transdisciplinary. It's a field that cannot be reduced into an isolated, compartmentalized box of its own. There are other areas of study which feed into an understanding of peace and conflict studies. And that's why week 2 of this course focuses on perspectives. Okay? So on Monday, you had the perspective from gender and how that relates to the larger field of peace and conflict studies. Yesterday, you looked at another perspective which comes from food security, sustainable agriculture. Today, we will be looking at human rights. Tomorrow, you look at the same interface from the perspective of media, and of course, the rise of social media. And of course, then on Friday, you have your presentations, and next week, we will be looking at what we call as interventions. Okay, so how do we intervene into conflicts that you have analyzed in first week, from the diverse perspectives that you have looked at in the second week? How do you then intervene into those conflicts for conflict resolution, transformation, etc.? Okay, so that's what you will be looking at in week 3. Okay, now, the topic for today, this interface between human rights, conflicts, and peace building, is extremely complex for a variety of reasons. I'll just focus on 4 reasons to begin with, and we'll expand on these as we go ahead. The first reason why this interface is so complex is because there is, in fact, no consensus among scholars and people on the very concept of human rights. We might like to assume that human rights are universal, they are interdependent, indivisible, etc. But the truth is that there are, in fact, a variety of different perspectives on what the very idea of human rights means. Okay, and that obviously makes it very complex. The second reason why this interface becomes complicated is because there is, again, no consensus on what particular norms should be recognized as human rights. I think any rational person, and I am sure everyone in this room, would agree that access to safe and potable water is a human right. We can't survive another day if we don't have water, access to safe water. You would, however, be surprised that it is one of the most contentious of all human rights norms. In fact, a lot of developed countries, United States being one of the most vociferous in it, has opposed the recognition of right to water as a human right. And this is not just the Trump administration. This is even in the Obama administration. They strongly opposed in 2012 the recognition of right to water as a human right. So there's this conflict about which norms can you accept. Okay, I'll give you more examples as we go ahead on this point. The third reason why this interface becomes so complicated is the factual matrix of what constitutes a violation of human rights. Okay, and all of this is extremely dependent on perspectives of different actors. You'll recall in the first week, Amar mentioned to all of you a statement which is one of those which is seared in my memory, and since I've heard him speaking about it for several years. No one wakes up in the morning and thinks I'm the bad guy. It's exactly the same with human rights. Whenever there's a conflict, every party to the conflict thinks they are the victim. No one thinks they are the bad guy. Everyone believes in their perspective that they are the victims of human rights abuses, okay, by the other side. So this is another complexity in the interface between human rights, conflict, and peace building. And the final reason is the intervention stage. We are talking here about what is an appropriate policy response, what is an appropriate intervention into conflicts where there are gross levels of human rights violations. Should we protect human rights of people whose rights are being violated in a conflict area through use of force? Is use of force an appropriate policy intervention? Or should we impose in other mechanisms ideas that are perceived as ideas from the outside into local cultures and contexts which might not be receptive to that and which might feel that this is a colonial idea, this is an imposition of a Eurocentric idea on us? Okay, so what is an appropriate intervention in human rights violations is another very important complexity that comes in. And as I'll go ahead, I'll give you examples of all these different complexities and how they play out in the context of this interface. So, this is the agenda for today. I will be beginning with what we call as the human dimension of peace. Human rights by itself, by nature, is very anthropogenic. Anthropogenic means that the field of human rights treats the human being as the center of the universe. Everything gravitates around us. Anyone, if at all, has rights, it's the human being. Okay, so the alternative discourses, for instance, are about rights of the nature, rivers having their own rights, environmental security, and all those things. From a human rights perspective, it's all about the human being. Even violations of the environment, degradation, are looked at from the perspective of the human right to environment. Okay, so everything is about the human dimension. The second point that I'll look at is what we call as the post-World War II New World Order and the institutional approach of the United Nations to human rights. United Nations has often been seen as an institution of liberal peace, as an institution which has a one-size-fits-all template of concepts, including the concept of human rights, and that's an institutional perspective, but we need to see where does that come from, what's the history behind the institutional perspective of human rights from the United Nations. We will then challenge that by looking at different perspectives that have been proposed by scholars from around the world, and there are generally 4 schools of thought. It's part of your material for today. We'll look at those different perspectives. And then finally, we will look at these conceptual conflicts and how they translate into real conflicts with real examples. Okay? So that is the agenda for today. And again, the idea here is to initiate you into the diversity of thoughts and to basically kind of take a step back and unlearn some of the conceptual prejudices we have about the whole field of human rights and its promotion. Okay? And then in your seminar activity, there's a very interesting TED Talk with our colleagues from the China Scholarship Program. I had already mentioned that we will watch a TED Talk by Dambisa Moyo. And that's a very interesting TED Talk for your seminar activity today. Those of you who will be in the other activity, you should nevertheless still watch that TED Talk. I'll make sure that it's circulated to all of you. Okay. Now, the starting point for the discussion, of course, is that the ultimate quest for all of us is to build safe societies and communities where all women, men, girls, and boys, everyone have 3 things. This is the human dimension of peace. 3 things: human security, human development, and human rights. Okay, now many assume that these are overlapping concepts, these are identical synonyms of each other. They are not. There are clear overlaps, but they are not identical concepts, and I'll explain in a bit what the differences are between these 3, but ultimately that's what we all are looking for when we look at conflict resolution and try to move towards what we call a sustainable peace or sustaining peace. Conflicts threaten all of the above. Whenever there's a conflict, there is a threat to human security, human development, human rights, and this quest is obviously then derailed. But the relationship also works in the other direction, that any violations of these, lack of human security, lack of human development, lack of human rights, also can lead to conflicts. Okay, so conflicts derail this, but they also lead to conflicts. So it's not a unidirectional relationship between conflicts on the one hand and the human dimension of peace on the other. Now, where do these ideas come from of human security, human development, human rights? Why the focus on the human so much? As it turns out, these concepts came about as a rejection of the concentration of focus only on the sovereign state. Okay, so the idea of human development emerged because traditionally, till the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the idea of development was only measured in terms of income or wealth. If a country had a larger GDP, it was a developed country. Okay? But what this concept did was that it masked the inequities and inequalities that lie within societies. There's a huge amount of income inequality within societies and between countries as well. Okay, so measuring income or the wealth of a country only on the basis of the GDP was a concept that was completely rejected. This started in the year 1989 with the UNDP's Human Development Reports and crystallized firmly around 1994. Okay? When came the concept of human security? Human security, like human development, is also a rejection of the focus of security on the national. When we generally think about security, or when people think about it, what they do is they think about it in militaristic terms. The idea that our borders are secure, how much arms and ammunition a country has. Okay, so that's the idea of security. What human security says is that we must not focus on the national. What is more important is the security of the human person. Can the human person live another day with dignity is much more important to focus on for any government, for the international community, for local communities, than focusing on national security. Okay? The third concept of human rights is also a rejection of the concentration of rights in the sovereign. Now, human rights as a field is very old. It is many different traditional societies, whether we talk about the, in Confucianism, or whether we talk about indigenous societies from around the world, societies in the Middle East, India, etc. Human rights in Africa, Ubuntuism, the idea of human rights has always been present. Okay? However, what we today have as the universal norm of human rights, to a large extent, is the creation of the United Nations system post-World War II. Okay? It was only at that point that a first common universal understanding of human rights came about. So in a way, it is Eurocentric. And I'll point out the critiques of this as well as we go ahead. However, if you look at the genesis of this idea of human rights from the mainstream dominant perspective today, people have traced it to the French Declaration, okay, of the 1780s, I think 1789 if I'm not wrong. And what did the French people do there? What the French people did was that they protested against the concentration of rights in the monarchy. And they said rights are not to be looked at from the state's perspective. We need to look at rights from the human being's perspective. That is where the power, that is where the rights should be vesting. Okay? So all of these three concepts, human development, human security, human rights, are in effect a rejection of the concentration of power of rights within the state concern. So what's the difference? Okay, now this is a very simple way of understanding the difference between human security, human rights, and human development. And the reason I'm taking the time out to explain this is because you will be grappling with these concepts in literature, in your readings, in whichever program you are in, throughout the year. But even today, whenever, even seasoned researchers and writers, even whether they belong to academia or the United Nations, often tend to confuse these terms. They have massive policy implications on the ground as well. Okay? So what's the difference? Human security focuses as a concept on the very basic minimum threshold requirements that are essential for human beings to live another day with dignity. The very basic minimum threshold requirements. So what would they be? They would be food, clothing, shelter, health, and it's not just a terrible life. You're talking about living another day with dignity. So things such as freedom from fear, freedom from want, all of these are also essential concepts within the idea of human security. To draw a parallel from the terms that are more prevalent in peace and conflict studies, last week you looked at basic needs as a theory. Okay, so human security relates or correlates to the idea of basic needs. These are the very minimum basic requirements that are essential for human beings to survive another day with dignity. As we advance from that threshold, we are moving towards human development. Okay? And human development, as you can see, is not an end point. This is a vector. All of you are aware what's a vector? It's a term in physics, 9th grade physics. Everyone? So a vector is a line with an arrow, okay, with a direction. So this is the vector. Human development is not an end point. You can never claim that you have reached the final epitome of human development. It's always a constant effort at enhancing from any given threshold, any previous given threshold. Okay, so that's human development. As you advance from the basic levels, you're moving towards human development. Where do human rights fit into all of this? Human rights is the language of claims and entitlements. It is the tool that human beings have to say that I am entitled to human security or human development, and there is a corresponding duty bearer. Someone else has the duty to provide that to me. Okay? You don't go to a court of law and say that my human security is violated. You articulate it in the language of rights and duties. You say, I have the right to food. I have the right to life. That's how you make claims. Okay, so what does human rights add to this framework? It provides you the language of claims and entitlements. It allows reframing of human security and human development, not just as objectives or goals to be achieved, but as rights of human beings. Okay? It's not, human security is not just an aim, it's not just a goal. What human rights say is that it's a right. Human beings are entitled to it, someone else, the state in particular, has a duty to provide it. Okay, now this framework, as I pointed out, generally is, many people tend to look at it overlappingly as if they're synonymous. They're clear overlaps, but they're not synonymous. In practice, this can result in problems when in post-conflict interventions, you're reconstructing a society which is ravaged by war. You go in with a template of human development when actually what the society needs is a template of human security. This has been a common mistake over time. Lessons have been learned, including by the United Nations, but this has happened many times. You go into a post-conflict society and think that elections, holding a democratic election by electoral ballot, something that would be closer to the human development vector rather than ensuring that people have food, clothing, shelter first, has failed dramatically in many places. Okay, the most visible example where scholars have talked about this quite a lot is post-Saddam Iraq, where United States felt that let's hang Saddam, let's hold elections by electoral ballot, and everything will be rainbow and sunshine. Didn't work. What happened? Daesh came in. Daesh, ISIS, right? Emerged in the entire region. So, and took over. This has been a common problem. Without first addressing the human security dimensions, next steps have been taken which don't really work on the ground. That's why these frameworks are very important. Okay, then, let me now come to the post-World War II New World Order. Now, what happened was that when the World War II was coming towards an end in the early 1940s, Franklin Roosevelt, who was then the President of the United States, coined the term New World Order. Okay? And the idea was that this New World Order should be based and built on 4 pillars. The first pillar being peace, the second being human rights, the third being finance, and the fourth being trade. We should regulate all of these 4 pillars in a way that the circumstances that led to World War II do not emerge in the first place. Now, peace and human rights were obvious candidates. because of the events of the war itself, because of the Holocaust, because of the atomic bombs, etc. Okay, so you needed peace and human rights to be the pillars of the New World Order. Why finance and trade? Now, this has a lot to do with the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States. What happened was that European countries were fighting with each other at the time, with Germany and Italy and partly at some point Spain on one side, and then you had the United Kingdom, France, etc. on the other side, and they engaged in what we call as protectionist measures against each other. What you see today between United States and China, right? We won't sell you, we won't buy from you. As a result, the entire world economy collapsed, which is the prediction also for the global economy. We are heading towards a recession now because of ridiculous strategies and moves, sorry to say, by Donald Trump. But that's where exactly we are moving towards. Okay, so now what happened here was exactly the same, and we don't learn from history. The world economy collapsed. The US stock exchange, which was transatlantic, across the Atlantic, also collapsed because the entire world economy had fallen down. And many historians argue that that was the reason which led United States to join the war in the first place. US was not part of World War II initially. It joined because of the Great Depression. Okay? And therefore, what happened was that when the New World Order was being framed, Franklin Roosevelt said, let's create international rules whereby protectionism is no more allowed. Okay? States won't be allowed to take protectionist measures when they please. Now, you can't just have these concepts and say that we have a new world order. You need to institutionalize them. You need to create institutions for that. So for peace and human rights, the United Nations was created. Okay, so today we are looking at one of the principal objectives of the UN, which is human rights. The other is peace and security, which we will look at next week. For finance, what they created was what we know as the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Okay? These were established in 1944-45 in order to regulate international finance. To regulate international trade, they sought to create, the idea was that they would create an organization which was supposed to be called as the International Trade Organization. That organization never came into force because, as generally happens, United States leads the negotiations as they led the negotiations for ITO. There's a change in the government in the United States and a new government comes in and says, we back out. We don't want to accept. That's what happened, for instance, with the Paris Climate Agreement, right? I mean, Obama administration led the negotiations, came to an agreement, Trump comes in and withdraws, okay? So same thing happened with the International Trade Organization. So the organization itself never came into force. What did come into force, however, was a very important agreement, which to my mind runs the world today, is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, okay? This agreement came into force in 1947 and eventually in 1994 metamorphosed into what we today know as the World Trade Organization. Okay? So if you look at institutions of today, the principal institutions of global governance that have been established, that are today, all of them are the creation. They have their genesis in the post-World War II New World Order. Okay? So all institutions of global governance, even today, in 2018, have their birth in this vision of the post-World War II New World Order. So, in terms of human rights, okay, so as we saw that the United Nations is one of the important purposes and pillars of the United Nations is human rights. Okay? Now there are very few provisions in the United Nations Charter on human rights. I'm not going to burden you with them in this lecture, but just to point out that in its Article 1, which lists the purposes of the United Nations, human rights and its promotion is one of the most important purposes. So that's the institutional objective of the very existence of United Nations, is promotion of human rights. However, interestingly, despite the inclusion of the term in the UN Charter, there was factually no common understanding among states on what human rights meant. They liked the idea, they put it in, But every state understood human rights slightly differently. There was no common understanding. There was no document existing at that time at a global level which said this is our common understanding of human rights. Okay? So that process had to start, and that started with what is called as the Commission on Human Rights, which doesn't exist anymore. It did exist at that time. It was a body set up under one of the principal organs of the United Nations, which is the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. When you look at the United Nations system course in the third course of the year, we'll look at these different bodies more carefully. But the Commission on Human Rights was mandated to do 3 tasks. The first was draft an international bill of human rights, which would be declaratory in nature and therefore non-binding. The idea was we don't have a common understanding of what human rights means. Let's come together and draft a document which would be declaratory. It won't be a binding treaty. States won't be legally bound by it. Okay? But let's at least have a consensus on what we understand commonly by human rights among the scholars of the world and different states. The second step was that now that we have a common understanding, let's convert this into binding legal treaties that every country would sign and ratify and would legally, under international law, commit themselves to respecting, protecting, fulfilling at their national levels. Okay? The third document was, now that we have a consensus, now that we have a legally binding agreement, let's have a document for enforcing violations of those rights by the states concerned. If a state, after having undertaken legal obligations, violates those rights, does not provide those rights to the people, we need to find an accountability mechanism under international law, okay, under the international system. This could have been anything. It could have been a world court, it could have been a human rights court, whatever. I mean, that was the whole idea that was created there. Now, it was in compliance with the first objective of having a consensus document which would be non-binding, that what we know as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was drafted. Okay? So the UDHR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was drafted and adopted in 1948. It was drafted by a committee of experts from around the world, so different civilizations were represented, and everyone agreed that this is what we together around the world now can call a catalogue of human rights. Okay? The Universal Declaration did not by itself confer any new rights. It did not say that henceforth human beings shall be entitled to this. What it did was it only declared, that's why it's called a declaration. It declared what scholars from around the world thought inherently vests in human beings simply because we are born as human beings. Okay? So all those rights that they felt that human beings inherently have because of our human embodiment are what is declared in the Universal Declaration. It does not create new rights, it does not confer new rights, it only declares what human beings already have. Every human person has the right to life. Okay? So it declares that what rights human beings have. Now, one important thing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was that it came at the cusp of the beginning of Cold War. World War II ended, Universal Declaration came, and then the Cold War started gaining steam. Now, as you all know, the Cold War was basically a war between two ideologies, the ideology of the communist countries and the ideology of the capitalist countries. Okay? Capitalist countries believed that only civil and political rights are human rights. Now, what are civil and political rights? Civil rights would be right to life, right to freedom of speech and expression, right to protest, right to movement, freedom of movement, right to information. All of these are civil rights. Political rights, the right to stand for office, right to vote, right to be elected based on your own preferences if you qualify. All of these are liberties that are recognized and freedoms that are recognized in civil and political rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights are those rights which require the state to do something. Okay, the state can't just sit back. State has to do something to provide people those rights. So, right to health. A state can't just say that everyone has the right to health. The state needs to do something. Right to education. The state needs to do something. Okay? Right to social security. Right to livelihoods. If these are to be guaranteed, states need to do something. Right to health. States need to do something. So the communist bloc said that only these rights are really human rights. Okay, we don't believe in civil and political rights. The capitalist bloc said that, well, all of these rights, the right to health, the right to education, these are all wonderful aspirational goals, and that's today, even today, the official stand of the United States. Okay, so these are all aspirational goals, but these are not really human rights. Human rights are only civil and political. On the other hand, they said this is all communist ideology, that state should provide housing to people, state should provide education to people, the state should provide health to people. These are all what the Marxists, what the communists want to do. Okay, this is not the capitalist idea. Capitalism is everyone has freedom to do what they want. The state should just back off. State should not interfere. Okay, let there be free markets. State should not intervene in any way. Okay, so the Cold War basically meant that because of these split ideologies, the original idea of adopting one single human rights legally binding instrument or treaty could not materialize. Therefore, we have two separate treaties. One is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the other is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The capitalist bloc, when they came about, ratified or agreed only to the civil and political rights, whereas the communist bloc only legally undertook obligations related to economic, social, and cultural rights. Today, to a large extent, with the European countries also accepting economic, social, cultural rights, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the leader in the communist ideology, Russia, its successor, also has agreed to both human rights. So to a large extent, this division, this ideology, had tapered off. However, we have the ideology of Soviet Union versus United States has now, to a large extent, changed into United States and China. And why is it interesting? Because even today, China has not accepted that civil and political rights are human rights. And even today, United States has not accepted that economic, social, and cultural rights are human rights. Okay? And I'll explain this through the debate on Obamacare. What was that about? I'll explain this a bit later, okay, in the United States. So the Cold War mentality continues even today, and I would say that it's a very visible expressions of the fact that it's only expanding now. Just new actors. It's just United States and China replacing United States and Soviet Union. Okay, but that same idea continues. So even today, China would say that, well, people don't really have freedom of right to information. Freedom of speech and expression is not something we want to guarantee. In the larger interest of the society, we want to be able to control that. Okay? United States would say, well, it's not the state's business to provide education to people. So every student in the United States would be in tremendous debt because it's United States government doesn't believe it's that education should be is the role of the state as such. So this is the ideology that happened at that time. Now, over time, we have had the emergence of what are called as core human rights treaties. Apart from the two covenants that I referred to, civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, these are the other 7 ones, which, just to take note of, these are just to highlight the fact that the United Nations system has moved very, very strongly towards further crystallizing the idea of human rights. So these 7 treaties, one is on elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. The other is elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Convention against torture. Convention on the rights of the child. We have one on the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, which, as you can imagine, is the least ratified treaty. It's not accepted by most countries in the world. You have one which is protection of all persons from enforced disappearances, something that happened quite a lot in Latin America in the past and continues to happen in many parts of the world. People are just disappeared from one day and they're never to be found again. Okay? So that's criminalized. There's a convention on that. And then a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. Okay? So together, these 7 conventions and the 2 covenants, civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights, and the UDHR is what we refer to as the corpus of international human rights law. There are other conventions which feed into, but this is the main. This is the core of what we call as international human rights law. Now, in terms of the official position of the United Nations, if you go to any UN website, particularly the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, this is the official stand, okay? That human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. These rights are all interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. Okay? The principle of universality of human rights is the cornerstone of international human rights law. Now, this is obviously an idea which would appeal to a lot of us. I mean, the idea that human rights are inherent, they are universal, they are all interrelated, is not something that one would normally quarrel with. Okay? However, as I pointed out earlier, it turns out that this is not the only perspective. There are many scholars who have looked at human rights from different perspectives. Some romanticize the idea of human rights, that it's the final utopia. Some are more grounded. They say that, well, human rights don't really exist in human beings just because we are human beings. Someone needs to sit down in a room and agree and recognize human rights for human beings. Okay, so that act of agreement is something that's very necessary for these kinds of scholars. They don't romanticize the idea that, well, just because we are born as human beings, we have some human rights. There are some activists who are fighting for it, and their argument is that human rights don't really exist. We need to fight for them. Okay? They don't exist till we actually fight them and secure them. And then there are final types of scholars who trash human rights as a pretension. They say this is all nonsense. Okay? And scholars from this field are basically those who also come from what is called as a very neo-colonial theory perspective. They are scholars who look at human rights as a tool of oppression. They look at the language of human rights as a language that's used by the powerful countries against the weaker countries to continue their subjugation as the third world. Okay? So you have these different types of scholars who look at human rights quite differently, and I'll give you examples of each one of them from what they say. Now, one of the things which is very important here is this, that human rights scholars are not restricted to international law at all. Human rights scholars come from a variety of different fields. These are not just scholars, but also practitioners, policymakers. So you would find lawyers, of course, but political scientists often talk about human rights, international relations, philosophers, post-colonial studies, gender studies, peace education, anthropology, social work, economics, sociology. You have a variety of different scholars giving in their understandings, their inputs of what human rights means to them. So their academic work influences them. But most importantly, their lived experiences also influences what human rights mean to them. Okay, lived experiences can be your individual lived experiences of violations because you have faced it, but it could also mean you've worked on the ground, in the field, in some area where you have seen a lot of human rights abuses and you've worked with victims. So those lived experiences also shape your understanding of what human rights means. To give you a parallel, on the first day, for instance, you did the exercise of the 4 definitions of peace, right? Every year something varies, but generally it's not very uncommon for us at UPeace to see that there would be a group of students who would walk towards the definition that says peace is just the absence of war. Where do these people come from typically? We have had in the past, these students come from Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, for whom the ability to survive another day is peace. Are they wrong? Of course they're not. Their idea of peace is based on their lived experiences. Okay? They're not wrong. It's just that of course everyone would want to have human rights and sustainable development and what have you. But for them, their lived experiences shows that, well, for them, peace is absence of war. Okay? So we need to bear in mind that perspectives of different people matter. And these are often shaped by lived experiences. Same is true of human rights. Same is true of globalization. What does globalization mean to you? If you're a farmer who's lost livelihood because of free trade, your markets are flooded with cheap imported food products from elsewhere, globalization is a bad thing for you. Okay, so all of these are based on lived experiences, okay, of people. And that's an extremely important thing to bear in mind. So, these are Mary Benedict Dembour's 4 schools of international, of human rights. The first are natural scholars who conceive of human rights as a given. They are there, we are just born with it. There are the deliberative scholars who say that there are no human rights unless they are agreed upon. Then there are the protest scholars who argue that human rights are fought for, they don't exist. We need to snatch them, we need to fight for them. The more activist kind of scholars, based of course on their lived realities. And then you would have the discourse scholars who would say that human rights is just a pretension of policymakers, scholars, powerful people who sit in armchairs on ivory towers and talk about human rights and basically blame us for not being able to provide. Okay? So these are 4 perspectives. Now let's look at Jack Donnelly, who comes from the natural school. He's a lawyer. A political scientist. He writes in 2003 in a book called Universal Human Rights in Theory and Practice. He says, if human rights are the rights one has simply because one is a human being, as they usually are thought to be, then they are held universally by all human beings. Human rights claims rest on a prior moral and international legal entitlement. The source of human rights is man's moral nature. Human rights are at once a utopian ideal and a realistic practice for implementing that ideal. So we are all, as human beings, morally upright species. We are not, as some scholars have said, a brutal, barbaric species. We are very morally upright. And because we have sense of inherent dignity within us, that's the source of human rights. We are just born as dignified species. Okay? That our moral nature is the source of our human rights. So very romantic idea of what human rights means. It's a given. I mean, how could we not have human rights? We are born as human beings. Okay. Then this is the deliberative school. Tom Campbell, a lawyer. He wrote this book in 2006. Writes a critical introduction. And as lawyers are generally, nothing is there unless you sit down in a room and hash out an agreement, right? So it comes from the deliberative school that it has to be agreed. This is what he says. My view is that what rights people have is a matter of social fact. It's not a given, it's a matter of social fact. Though I accept that moral judgment is involved in answering the next question, what rights ought to exist? Rights as we know them are contingent historical phenomena with inherited meanings and contents rather than cultural and historical universals, although this is what we may strive to make them for the future. We might want to make human rights as universal, that's our goal, but right now they are not. We need to agree to what human rights are till we reach a stage where we can claim that it's the final, we have won the final war. So rights do not exist until they are routinely secured. The question to be answered is how we can best turn manifesto rights, and so he dismisses the natural scholars who say they are just given as manifesto rights. These are your manifesto rights. These are not really real rights. We need to agree upon them. Which express demands or proposals, these are only manifesto rights, demands or proposals, as to what rights ought to exist into rights that actually do exist. So someone like him would say, the right to water is not really a human right because it needs to be agreed upon by everyone. Natural law scholars would say agreement is immaterial. We are born as human beings, so of course we have the right to water. How can we survive another day? Okay, so that's the difference between the deliberative and agreed and natural scholars. Now the protest scholars, Upendra Bakshi, he is a lawyer, but a lawyer who is the founder, one of the founders of a school of international law called TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law. Okay, so they also look at international law with a very critical eye as a tool for neocolonialism. So this is what he says. I take it as axiomatic that the historic mission of contemporary human rights is to give voice to human suffering, to make it visible and to ameliorate it, whether or not a world bursting forth with human rights norms and standards is a better world than one bereft of human rights languages still remains an open question. The originary authors of human rights are people in struggle, not diplomats sitting in an air-conditioned room in the United Nations conventions, not just the fact that you assume that you have them human rights. The originary authors of human rights are people in struggle and communities of resistance who are fighting to secure them. They don't have them, they're fighting for it. What makes contemporary human rights movement precious is the fact that they deny all cosmological as well as terrestrial justifications for the imposition of universal unjustified human suffering. So we have, that's the good thing about the human rights movement. It's a movement, but we need to fight for actually securing them. The movement helps us identify that there's a lot of suffering. Okay, so it's a good movement. We need to be part of that, but the original authors are people who don't have those. It's their perspectives that matter, not the perspectives of whoever is drafting an international treaty. Okay, so this is the protest school. And as you can imagine, they basically protest against the status quo. They're protesting against what exists today in terms of human rights discourse and practice. And then you have the discourse school, which is, the person who would best represent this would be Makau Mutua. He was the dean of Buffalo Law School in the United States, but is Kenyan. He is in fact contesting a very important politician right now in Kenya, trying to contest the presidency, but a tremendous scholar. This is what he writes. Okay? I wrote this book because I wanted to explain why I believe that the human rights corpus should be treated as an experimental paradigm, a work in progress, and not a final inflexible truth. It is important that the human rights movement be fully exposed so that its underbelly can be critically examined. I know that many in the human rights movement mistakenly claim to have seen a glimpse of eternity and think of the human rights corpus as a summit of human civilization, a sort of an end to human history. This view is so self-righteous and lacking in humility that it of necessity must invite probing critiques from scholars of all stripes. So a very strong rejection of the idea of human rights as movement as it is today. And these are scholars who look at how human rights has been projected, how it has been thrust upon people with a very particular ideology, with a very particular agenda. They look at human rights. So for instance, the United States would officially at the United Nations, or some of the European countries would or Australia, at the United Nations would criticize strongly an African country for human rights violations. There is a sort of a moral vantage point on which you are standing as these countries accusing others. Are there no human rights violations in the United States? Or are there no human rights violations perpetrated by European countries? A tremendous amount of that, right? So what these scholars look at is the moral standing of countries. And what they point out is, well, it then becomes a tool for the powerful countries to impose things such as sanctions against the weaker countries. Okay? Because you are violating human rights. So whoever is powerful gets to do that. Now, sanctions are not really because you're worried about the dignity of workers in a poor country. Sanctions are because you want to benefit from, you want to impose a trade sanction so that cheap products don't flood your markets. Okay? There could be other reasons for that. You're just pretending that your reason is human rights. Okay, so these are discourse scholars such as Makau Mutua. And I'll give you another example of where Makau Mutua comes in. He's an extremely interesting but very controversial scholar also. So I'll point out one example of where that comes from. Now I want to move from conceptual conflicts to real conflicts. What we have seen so far are the conflicts among scholars on how we should understand human rights. Okay, now let's talk a bit about some other conceptual conflicts and how that translates into real conflicts. I'll give you 3 examples of real conflicts, different levels, some violent, some not violent. But before that, there is one very important question that also comes up in this context is, can human rights exist if they are not legislated upon, if you don't have a law in your country or an international law, which you call as legislation? In the absence of legislation, can you have human rights? Okay. The second is justiciability. Justiciability refers to the ability to go to a court of law and claim enforcement. Okay? There could be many cases which are on the law, but you don't have access to courts. Okay, so you need both legislation and justiciability. Okay, so the question here is, can you have human rights existing? Do human rights exist if they are not legislated upon, or even if there is no possibility for you to go to a court of law? Okay, so there are again different perspectives on this. The first one comes from James Nichol. James Nichol is a more progressive scholar, typically belonging to the natural school. He says legal enforcement or justiciability of rights is not determinative of the character of a human right. Okay? Because human rights are those that we already have. You don't need a law to say that you have human rights. Right to water may not be legally accepted in many countries. Okay? Right to health is not something that is accepted in many countries' domestic constitutions. You can't go to a court of law in many countries and claim direct violations of your right to food. Okay? But that doesn't mean that they are not human rights. Okay, so that would be James Nichol. Jeremy Bentham, the old philosopher, the very famous Anarchical Fallacies from 1791, this is what he says. Okay? Rights, the substantive right, is the child of law. You need to have first the law. Only from law can come rights. The law is the parent. Rights are born from law. Okay? So, right, the substantive right, is the child of law. From real laws come real rights. But from imaginary laws, from law of nature, that we are born as human beings, from law of nature, can come only imaginary rights. Natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. You know what stilts are, right? Those wooden things that people climb on and become very tall. So his way of saying elevated nonsense, some elevated form of nonsense. Okay, so natural rights are just nonsense. Okay, so they are born from laws. Exactly the opposite is Herbert Hart, another very important scholar, says human rights are parents of law. They motivate specific legislations. Legislations come about to protect right to health, right to water, because they already exist as human rights. Legislations are simply motivated because human rights exist. Persons with disabilities have human rights. Children have human rights. We need laws to secure those human rights. Okay, so human rights exist. Laws are born from them. Okay, so who's the parent, who's the child? You can see there is a debate on that. So the questions: do human rights exist only when they are legislated? Do human rights exist only when they are legally enforceable or justiciable? So Amartya Sen, now this is a philosophical angle. Okay, so Amartya Sen is one of the leading philosophers in the world. He's also an economist, a Nobel laureate. He wrote this extremely important book, in my perspective, called The Idea of Justice in 2009. And he gives an explanation from a philosophical perspective of what human rights mean. Okay, to him. Human rights are ethical claims. They are ethical claims, not legal. They are ethical claims, constitutively linked with the importance of human freedom and the robustness of an argument that a particular claim can be seen as a human right, has to be assessed through scrutiny of public reasoning involving open impartiality. Okay, so he gives two examples of what he means by ethical claims and why we should delink them with legislation and justiciability. He says that, well, there are certain rights which are not even proper subjects of being legislated upon. They may not be appropriately legislated because you can't really do that. There are some rights which you can't really go to a court of law to keep suing people, but that doesn't mean they're not human rights. Okay, so the examples: recognizing and defending a wife's right to have an effective voice in the family decisions, often denied in traditionally sexist societies. He says this is obviously a right, but it may not be something that you can properly put on the legislation. You may not be able to put it in legislation. How do you say that, couples should have an effective voice in the family affairs? How are you going to monitor that? How are you going to enforce that? Okay? So it may not even be a proper subject of legislation, but doesn't mean that it's not a human right. Okay? The other example, the right of a stammerer not to be ridiculed in public meetings. Now, if I stammer and one of you starts, instinctively, just laughs, it doesn't mean that the proper response to that is me going to a court to sue you, right? It may be your education. It may be awareness in you. Okay, it may be a bunch of different things. But access to courts for suing may not really be an appropriate thing. Also, in case of this, applies equally to other matters, not just human rights, of peace and conflict studies also. We tend to believe, a lot of people tend to believe that courts of law are the solution to every conflict. It doesn't really work always that way. Sometimes does, but on most occasions don't. Most conflicts in the world are not resolved through courts of law. Okay. Then, James Nichol on enforceability again, he says, legal enforceability before courts is not essential for existence of norms as human rights. Legal enforceability merely makes a human rights more effective. Why does it happen that way? Because when you have legal enforceability, when you have access to courts, you have one more avenue for holding states accountable. That one more avenue is the court. But it doesn't mean that you don't have other avenues. In fact, most human rights claims against the state for violations are not resolved through courts. They are resolved through other mechanisms. Okay? Which other mechanisms? Fair elections. People are voted out in a functioning democracy. If they perceive you as violating human rights, they may shun you out. Free press is a very important tool for holding governments accountable. The principal dominant mechanism in international affairs is called naming and shaming. Okay, so there is no World Court on Human Rights existing. So everything in international relations, international law, in human rights works on the principle of naming and shaming. You name a particular country as a violator and then hope that they are shamed by it. Okay, so naming and shaming. Sometimes it really, really does work. There are countries who take naming and shaming extremely seriously. They take the ability, they take the idea that you would be shamed in a public forum for being a violator of human rights very seriously. Okay, so it works many times, and there are many different mechanisms in which you can name and shame. One of them, of course, is inquiries by national human rights institutions. Okay, national human rights institutions are not courts, but they conduct inquiries. Human rights impact assessments, another tool where, like environment impact assessments, you can produce reports and say, okay, this particular dam project results in these violations of human rights. The government, if it continues, would be committing gross violations. Okay? International human rights bodies, none of those are courts. All the human rights bodies under the United Nations only have advisory or recommendatory powers. The whole purpose is name and shame. None of them has legally binding powers. But the more important ones that we often find day in and day out are protests. Sometimes violent, sometimes non-violent. When people go to the streets complaining about some action by the government, they don't have to articulate that my human right under Article so-and-so of the Constitution is violated. But what they're protesting against is essentially that. You could have violent protests, you could have non-violent protests. The Arab Spring, what's happening in Venezuela, could be, many other parts of the world, violent protests. But you also have non-violent protests. I mean, in Costa Rica, you find that often. The red taxi drivers, for instance, when taxes go up and Uber comes in with, their livelihoods go away, they have a silent march. Okay, so you do have protests working that way also. Okay, Hong Kong, you see today a lot of violent protests going on as well. So whatever is the truth, people's perspectives, in Kashmir, people's perspectives matter. Okay, if they feel that their rights are violated, they would have a variety of different ways of holding governments accountable for it. Okay, so courts are not the only option. Now, two real conflicts, 3 examples. Many countries, as I've pointed out, do not actually recognize several norms as legal rights through legislations and don't make them legally enforceable before courts. However, their non-recognition has not really stopped people, human beings, from fighting for them to secure them violently as well as non-violently. Okay, so right to water. Right to water is not recognized, as I said, as a human right by many countries in the world. Now, where did this come out from? So, anyone's heard of Cochabamba? Okay. So Cochabamba is a town in Bolivia which became the epicenter of violent civil riots because the municipality was forced to take a loan from International Monetary Fund and other development banks with the condition that they would privatize supply of water to the citizens. Okay, so give it to a private company. Obviously, the private company was not Bolivian; it was a foreign private company from a conglomerate from European American companies. Okay, now the permission given to that company was that if anyone is not able to pay money, pay your fees for providing water supply, you are free to shut their taps off. Okay. Now, when the company came in and Cochabamba municipality was required to privatize it, the private company increased the fee for water supply by many times. As a result, people could not pay. Those who could not pay, their taps were shut off. And you can imagine, people went on the streets, protested, led to the collapse of the Bolivian government. A new government came in, and in 2012, the new government moved for a resolution at the United Nations for recognition of right to water as a human right. Okay, so this is a good example of right to water not being recognized at that point as a human right, but people still managed to secure it through protests. Okay, development, whether it's a human right or not, is an age-old discussion. There is a new treaty being drafted on whether development is a human right or not at the United Nations. I happen to chair that committee. So this is an age-old discussion. But if you think of the Arab Spring, what were people protesting against? People were protesting against basically denial of their priorities of life, their denial of development priorities by someone who's by a government that has lost touch with the realities of the people. You think about people protesting in Brazil when the Olympics were, when the World Cup was going on and stadiums were being built. People were on the streets basically challenging hike in bus fares on the ground that the government has completely wrong development priorities. You don't have to hike bus fares to build football stadiums. We are the ones who are suffering. People are on the streets. What are they complaining about? They're complaining about violation, denial of the right to development. They may not articulate it in that sense, but that's exactly what they're doing. So it doesn't matter whether development is recognized or not in law or enforceable through court, people know how to secure that. Okay? The other example, the real conflicts, is a non-violent one, perhaps, but the election, the transition from Obama to Trump. Obama's entire election campaign from the first term was based on Obamacare. What was he saying? He was saying that, he didn't articulate it that way, but this is exactly what was happening. Healthcare is a right of human beings, and the state has a responsibility to provide healthcare to people. The Republicans, on the other hand, Trump administration was saying that's not the role of the state. If people want to have their private insurances, they can have it. Why should the state provide health insurance? Okay? So what Obama was saying, that economic, social, cultural rights, right to health, is a human right. What the Trump administration immediately said is that only civil and political rights are human rights. The state has no business in providing healthcare to people. Okay? So all these conceptual differences play out in real life also. Okay? Whether it's a violent conflict or a structural conflict, as is the case with healthcare in the United States. Now, one final comment, and this is this is relevant for your seminar activity. So, there is this idea of 3 generations. This is my final slide. There's this idea of 3 generations of human rights, okay, which was proposed by a Czech scholar called Karel Vasak in 1979. This model of 3 generations says that civil and political rights are first-generation rights, economic, social, cultural rights are second-generation rights, and what we call as collective or group rights are third-generation rights. Group rights or collective rights would mean rights of indigenous peoples. Those are rights you can't reduce to an individual. These are rights held collectively by a group, by a people. Okay, minorities, collectively held, etc. So these are third-generation rights. Now, traditional mainstream literature, if you go to any university in Europe or United States, if you open a law textbook, international law textbook, they would present this three generation as the correct framework of understanding human rights. But what this does is it completely obliterates the realities from other parts of the world. Many indigenous communities in the world first had communal rights. There's no idea of individual ownership of property. Everything is communally owned. Communal rights emerged the first. Even today, a lot of communities in Africa also, communities in India and South Asia also, indigenous communities around the world still have the idea of communal ownership of land. Then came the idea of economic, social, cultural rights, and finally came the idea of civil and political rights, that this is mine and this is yours. Not just tangible property, but even intellectual property is my own. Okay, no one else can steal. Okay, these individualization of rights is, to a lot of societies, very alien. It's an alien concept. Okay, so to make these generations' idea as the dominant narrative of international human rights law is essentially Eurocentricizing human rights, and a lot of people argue that this is nothing but neocolonialism. Okay, so what this generations debate also does is that it prioritizes civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights, because these are first generation, these are second generation. This generation's idea only reflects the evolution of human rights in the European tradition, as I pointed out. In Europe, with the French monarchy collapsing, civil and political rights came first. Economic, social, and cultural rights were accepted only in the 1970s. When the Cold War was it's towards somewhere in the middle, only then they accepted. And only now have European countries accepted communal rights, or group rights, collective rights. This is important because for your seminar activity today, the TED Talk is by a scholar called Dambisa Moyo. She is a Zambian economist, an economist from Zambia, a very popular one, but also an extremely controversial scholar. She has written this very important book called Dead Aid. Okay? In this book, she has basically challenged. She has argued that the main reason for Africa not to have emerged from income inequalities and poverty and hunger is aid. Aid is the main reason. Okay? So she's written that book called Dead Aid, okay, in which she has made many controversial statements and arguments. But this TED Talk, and I think it's it will be interesting, the discussion this year, because we have a large contingent also from China. And I would really encourage the Chinese students also to explain what their stand is on this point. And I already know that even that there are differences of opinion even among your group. Dambisa Moyo is giving a TED Talk in the United States and basically saying that what Africa needs today is the Chinese model, not the US model. Africa needs to prioritize economic, social, and cultural rights and not civil and political rights. So Africa, it's okay to deprioritize democracy. People worry more about whether they have food the next day rather than worrying about whether they have the right to vote. Okay? So her argument is that what Africa needs today is the Chinese model of prioritizing economic, social, cultural rights and deprioritizing democracy. A very controversial linking of this, which she has not said in the TED Talk, but which is in the book, is that what Africa needs today, this is my last sentence before we open up, is a benevolent dictator. Okay? What Africa needs today is a benevolent dictator. Deprioritize democracy, prioritize economic, social, and cultural rights. Okay, so you will find these policy debates going on quite a lot. Her TED Talk is extremely revealing. And I hope you all have a very interesting discussion. I'll stop there and let's take, I guess we don't have any time. Okay. All right, so thank you all. Have a good time.